Hi there, this is a bit of a process video in which we're going to talk about two basic tasks. We want to first talk about writing a summary sentence of a psychological article, and then I want to spend a couple more minutes on how to string together several such sentences into an argument. So this is a really basic building block of writing in psychology. Imagine, for instance, that you have two papers that you've read and you want to cite in a paragraph that you're writing. So we'll talk about how to write the sentence that cites each one of those. We'll talk about putting them together. We'll talk about emphasizing the point they make as a duo once you have put them together. This process has 5 steps that I've identified. The first of which is to try to frame your argument. So I want you to start by thinking about what question you're trying to answer. In the paragraph you're about to write, what does it need to say? Or even more specifically, what does this paragraph need to tell your reader? If you're writing persuasively, you might be needing to convince the reader of something. How does this paragraph then back up that stance you're taking? Or if you're trying to answer a scientific question, how does this paragraph further the reader's knowledge? How does it help them answer that question? Make sure you know the frame. Make sure you know what you want your reader to get out of the paragraph. Once you have that figured out, decide on how each of the papers you wish to include in the paragraph contributes to the point you need to make with the paragraph that you just figured out in step 1. Keep in mind that the main point of the paper might be the same as the main point of your paragraph, but it also might not. You might be taking a tangential point made in the paper and using the paper to make that point in this paragraph. Lots of things happen in any published piece of psychology. It could very well be the case that the main research question of the original authors is not the same as your research question, but the work they did contributes to your question as well. So be sure to think about exactly what part of the paper contributes to your argument. Then write smooth, short, summary sentences for each paper, and make sure they have accurate in-text citations. Try to avoid misusing common terms. We'll talk about the fact that in most cases here, research is a verb, study is a noun. And look at other papers for models for how to write these sentences smoothly. We'll do an example in just a bit. Step 4, now figure out how you're going to combine the sentences you've written. I'm using an example here with 2. It could be any number, though, up and beyond that. And the way they combine will be different in pretty much every writing situation. It might be the case that they both make the same point. And if that's true, then you might not even need separate sentences for them. You might just cite them both in one set of parentheses at the end of a single sentence. Or you might want to say them separately because they make the point, but differently enough that it's worth pointing out. Or maybe one paper builds on the other. You've got a point made in paper A that you need stated clearly so that you can then make the point in paper B because of the way the logic flows. If that's the case, make sure you order them purposely. Don't put paper B first because the argument won't make sense to your reader. And when you're linking the two papers, make sure you link them appropriately as well. Make your transition statement or your transition word meaningful. Students occasionally make mistakes in which they will cite two papers that build on the same idea, but they'll use a sort of antithesis kind of transition statement, like although, in between the two. So work on those transitions if you need. Look into words used more often in academia. Look into some of the transition words used in some of the papers you are interested in. The very papers you're citing could be good sources for this kind of thing. I never used the word thus until I got into writing in psych, but it turns out to be pretty useful sometimes. Consider thus. Step 5, surround the writing you've now done, the summary sentences and the relationship between the two, with a clear introduction and conclusion sentence that refers back to the framing of your argument. What are you going to show us with these studies in that intro sentence? Then you give us the info from the studies, and then in the conclusion, restate what we know now and make sure that it is very, very clear. You want to state it in no uncertain terms. Make it clear as day what your reader should take away, even if you feel like when you write that sentence, it should be really obvious or you're being repetitive. That kind of stuff that is boring or repetitive or not thrilling in creative writing is sometimes necessary in scientific writing. So let's dive into those. Well, before we dive in specifically, let's talk about how you're going to use them. I've already mentioned that this basic framework will work for any number of papers. I'm going to talk about what happens when you want to combine two into a single argument in this video. And again, sometimes many papers will make the same single point, and so you can make the point then and cite all of them in one in-text citation. You'll see that in the example at the end of the video as well. But in general, the goal here is to follow the rule that you follow through all of persuasive argumentation type writing or science and research type writing, especially in psychology. If you make a claim, it should be immediately backed up by evidence in the following sentence, unless you have a really compelling narrative reason to hold off on presenting that evidence. But that's generally the rule. Claim evidence, claim evidence, claim evidence, and make sure that those claims follow each other and build to hopefully a bigger claim. So let's imagine you're writing a paper on the other race effect in eyewitness lineup identification. You want to note that most research is done with Caucasian participants identifying African American faces, but there is some other work, and you want to talk about the fact that there is probably a wider application of the other race effect than just the black and white version that's been done in a lot of the work, especially the early work. So you might start with one of the original meta-analyses of this topic, the one that first cemented the idea that the effect was real in the psychological literature. This is a meta-analysis done by Bothwell, Brigham, and Malpass, published in 1989. And so because this is kind of an original paper, because it's older and it states the thing, it states that the effect was found in many different places, it's kind of it's really good for making the point that the other race effect in face recognition exists. People are a little bit better at identifying faces of their own race than they are at identifying faces from other races. This is also a handy paper to use because it helps you make the point that, especially early on in the life of this literature, this effect was typically only investigated with Caucasian and African American faces and participants. But if you wanted to then go on and make the point that there is a little more research now, and some folks have looked into altering or manipulating race in a different way, or maybe alternative to that stated goal, you were just sort of trying to figure out how the other race effect works. Either way, you might have found this paper that compares Caucasian and Chinese samples, looking at Caucasian and Chinese faces. And this will go really nicely toward helping us make our point that there is lots of good other race effect research with more than just Caucasian and African American comparisons, especially in the last 10 years or so. So I've mocked up some summary statements for each of these. The Bothwell, Brigham, and Malpass is in the first. The other race effect is defined as the fact that people are better at remembering faces of their own race. Just a basic sort of definitional statement. I've written it in kind of a half sentence, a partial sentence, so that we can write it out in a paragraph without directly copying anything, so that our paraphrase is solid. And then in the second, I've got Mondlock et al. Observed an other race effect for Caucasian individuals remembering Chinese faces. So this is probably a usable sentence as it is. It's smooth. It has a good, clear citation. The verb observed is a really nice one to use for this kind of writing. It does not misuse any of those common terms. You can say, apart from observed, you could use found or saw or Mondluck et al.'s data showed. Those kinds of things are really nice ways to write these sentences. Try to avoid sentences like Mondluck et al. Did a study. You'll see that written occasionally, and it can be useful if you're going to summarize the whole study, but that is, I would say, the format of sentence that students most often fall back on in this kind of writing, so try to avoid that. You could talk about how they did research on this question as well. That's another more typical way to write this sentence, more student-y. A mistake I see folks make sometimes is turning research into a noun. They'll write that Mondluck et al. Did a research, and that hits my ear strange, and it might hit yours weirdly as well, and that's because research is usually more of a verb in this situation rather than a noun. To say someone did a research sounds a little off. They did a study. You could say they ran an experiment if they ran an experiment, or collected survey data. Try to be a little more precise, and that'll keep you safe. If you're trying to figure out new ways to write these kinds of sentences, don't worry about it too much. You don't have to be ultra creative with the structure of these. But have a look at some other published papers for some of the different ways they've written these sentences. And that should give you some good new ideas if you feel like you're running out. By the way, note that our takeaway from that Mondluck et al. Paper is not their main point. I said that could be the case. And it is, in fact. Their main point was something to do with eyewitness identification and cross-race identifications. But one of the things we're most interested in this sentence that I said we're writing has to do with the change of or continued manipulation of different races. So that's the main piece we're going to pull out. Quick little sidebar here on a totally different topic, that being whether an instructor should be present in a video lecture and what they should do in that video lecture. Here's a nice paragraph that gives you a bunch of different methods of citation and a bunch of different sentence styles and structures for those kinds of summary statements we were talking about on the previous slide. So we've got Fiorella and Mayer tested this hypothesis in a series of experiments. That's a really nice way to write that. And then they talk about what their results indicated. A recent study by Schrader and Traxler found, a nice way to use it again. So those are both ways to include the names in the sentence. There's a third one down here, the study by Fiorella and Mayer consisted of. It's back to that first one. And then we've got another fully in text or in parenthetical citation in which they say they're sort of showing us that there is another example of a similar kind of study in the literature. That's why it says see also. So these are a couple examples for ways to try to integrate these citations into your sentences in a nice clean way. So once you've got them written, it's time to combine. I've taken a stab at it here. If you want to try that yourself, actually, feel free to pause this video. Don't look at this sentence and give it a shot. But again, remember that it's going to be different in every situation. Here we're talking about building. It would be weird to talk about the fact that the other race effect has been observed for Caucasian individuals remembering Chinese faces before I make the point that most early work on the other race effect focused on Caucasian people remembering African American faces. So they have to be in this order to make the point that I want to make. It's important to do that. If we flesh that out a little bit, it might look something more like this if I add, say, an intro and a conclusion sentence around my two others. So I've added the beginning framing in which I say cross-race misidentifications can in part be attributed to the other race effect. And that's sort of moving from my topic that we stated at the beginning of this video into the question that this specific paragraph is going to answer. And then at the end, I say the ORE thus may be an issue for many different cross-race lineup identifications. You could even get more specific with that and say not just those done in a Caucasian and African American cross-race identification situation. Remember to be as clear as possible. It's going to probably feel obvious or repetitive to you as the writer. It will not feel like that to the reader. This is a version of that paragraph that you might call the final product. It's actually a sentence I pulled from a piece of student writing from several years ago, in which it's a little more placed into the context of the paper and has more citations so that you can get an idea for how you might get into a more complicated version of this kind of work. It has one little issue in that when you have several citations within a single parenthesis, you should alphabetize those citations by first author. So we've got that first set there with several is Mondlock et al., Boyce et al., DeGutis et al. Those, by the way, this paper is a little older, so the student was writing all those citations out. Those would all be et als according to the new APA guidelines. And you'd want to alphabetize them by the first author's name. So it would be Boyce et al., and then DeGutis et al., and then Mondlock et al. Have a look at this paragraph. See whether you would iterate it again, try to rewrite it, edit it a little bit. It certainly needs a conclusion sentence. Think about what kind of conclusion sentence you might write. And take these general lessons in this example forward. Good luck. I hope this is helpful. Remember to always back up your claims with evidence. Thanks for watching.